would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, tonight I'm joined with Juan Ayala, esoteric researcher, host of the One-on-One podcast, as well as Illuminati Confirmed with Mark Steves over there at My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Is there anything else additional that you'd like to add about yourself or your background? Do you also have like a magazine or something that you publish?
Yeah, so I do the Occultus Mundi, which is a esoteric journal, occulted topics, and I do have a comic book series I'm working on called The Chosen One. The first issue is out, and that has Mark from My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. He says what's up. I was actually on a podcast with him before this one.
Awesome.
We got Chris from Menta Podcast. The first issue is The Chosen One versus the Saturnian Cube, and essentially every issue is a different conspiracy, and we go on these rabbit holes. We poke fun at different conspiracy theories. And the second issue, we're wrapping it up now. That one has Sam Tripoli in it, Alex Stein's in it, and we have a whole bunch of other people in the community who are lined up to be in it, and I think it's going to be great. So yeah, you can find that on my website, theoneononepodcast.com. I have a few different shows that I'm on. You can find them all on my website or on my RSS feed. I do have a YouTube channel, the One-on-One podcast on there. Rockfin, patreon.com/one-on-one podcast, all that good stuff.
Excellent. And just for the listeners, that's One-on-One, like the name Juan, not the number one. Cool.
Yeah, it's Juan, Juan.
Yeah. So, all right, we're going to get a little wild today. Juan is going to get into the homunculus. He's somewhat of a homunculologist, if you will. Homunculus is something I know very little about, but I find it fascinating. I usually only hear kind of brief descriptions of it, but no one really seems to talk too much about it besides that, until I came across a podcast that you did recently, and I was like, sweet, he goes pretty deep. So where should we begin with this?
Wherever you want, man. Don't you do alchemy? Am I correct on that? You do some sort of alchemy too, right?
I've interviewed quite a few alchemists. That's kind of one of the subject matters of this podcast. Haven't really got into the homunculus though.
So
the main focus with that, it's primarily Spagyria. So it's kind of Paracelsian, vegetable alchemy that has to do with preparing different medicines and whatnot. It's called spagyrics. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah, I am. So the whole concept of alchemy, that's a whole 3-hour episode on its own. And the homunculus, which it's a topic that you can quite literally connect it to any other topic in a few. So there's, the 7 degrees of separation. Well, somebody actually ran the numbers on the top 50 topics of Wikipedia at the time, or the most often searched up topics. And it was like 3 clicks. So there's something called the Wikipedia game where you can click the links, the hyperlinks within a Wikipedia article. And to get to homunculus, it was the top 50 was 3 clicks. The top 100 was like 3.92 clicks. Somebody ran the math and with the topic homunculus. So it was like they put Rihanna, and from there they would connect it to something. It was like a whole diagram. The way that I came across it, because it is related to a lot of things, and of course, right, in the alternative thought realm, you can stretch things out, whatever. This topic relates to alchemy, relates to the occult, relates to whatever you want to relate it to. And I believe I'm in the realm that the same technology that was being used back then is the same tech that they're using today. That includes magic. They just put a different name on it. And magical systems are meant to be adapted, and they're meant to be changed up. You have the example I use is Crowley and Parsons. You know, Parsons was reading all about the Alamantra workings, the Cairo workings, all the stuff that Crowley was doing, and he adopted his own thing to do the Babylon working. So he had changed the system up, obviously using Enoch and John Dee, all those guys, and they use it to their benefit to however fits their motive. And the way I came across the homunculus, because I kind of trace it from its very origins all the way to what I, after the 16th century, which is Paracelsus, I put my own touch on it, where that's the speculative aspect, where like after Crowley, you can speculate who else was using this, and that's where I connected to the modern day elites, lizard people, whatever you want to call them, the archons, whoever, the people in power. All right, so I came across it while doing an episode on another show that I have, the Occult Book Club, and we were covering Manly P. Hall, his journal, The All-Seeing Eye, and there was a passage in there about this Freemason, Count Kufenstein, and he allegedly had created 10 homunculi. Homunculi is plural. And in that story, one of them was able to tell the future, and he had them at his lodge, and he had this assistant, and eventually they ended up dying off. The homunculus ended up dying off, and some of them tried to escape. But I found it really interesting, and I Googled that guy's name, and I came across this grimoire. And this is what really like sets people off, and what the people love about it, because it's a grimoire that gives you the recipes. And we have to understand that when I'm talking about the homunculus, the word homunculus means miniature man or small version of a man. So it's Latin. And that term doesn't come into fruition until the 16th century with Paracelsus. And so whenever we're talking about it pre-Paracelsus, it's going to be, they call it a rational animal, or the body outside of the body, or the Platonic sage, whatever. Like they don't artificial man, they don't call it a homunculus. They call it something else until Paracelsus comes into play. And that's when the word homunculus is born. The Liber Vitae, I came across that grimoire while doing research on, like, it was like a whole rabbit hole. I started with one thing, led to another. You know how it is. And the Liber Vitae was really interesting because the whole thing with grimoires, and the reason that this topic is so interesting and it really draws people in, is because you have two things going on. You have the idea of artificial life being created, which we know that exists today. IVF is literally the creation of a life outside of the matrix, the womb, and they put that into the womb of a woman. I mean, that's science, whatever you want to consider science. That's modern day. We know that happens. We know that the elites are looking for the elixir of life. You have Bezos and all these lizard type elites who are trying to live forever, transhumanism. You have Elon Musk. You have all these people. You have the Kardashians that all do surrogate. A lot of them do surrogate births. That's technically, that's the alchemical, the hermetically sealed vessel, right after the fact. So you can connect it, like I said at the beginning, any which way. And the Liber Vitae is a grimoire, and what grimoires were books. There are recipes for magical purposes. It was to show you how to, they would pass on this information. And during the Middle Ages, you had something that, you had magia naturalis, or natural magic, and you had alchemy. And magia naturalis, natural magic, was a Christian version of magic. And the reason that the Christians were okay with using it is because you weren't invoking any astral influences to do the magical work. You're only exposing what would already happen in nature, and you're either speeding up the process or slowing the process down. So you are using what would already be in nature. So we'll get into some of the ingredients. But back then, for example, physicians and magicians were the same. They were the ones who would expose in nature what would benefit man. So again, like I said, the speeding up of the natural process or slowing it down, and not using spirits or outside entities. That considers it astral magic, Goetia, whatever which magical branch you want to follow. And those who were able to master nature were seen as having great powers. You had Pythagoras, who could tell the future, who could divinate, who could do all these things. You know, he had a magical mirror and all this stuff. And those who were able to master nature, they could change the course of the moon. They were omnipotent. That was another thing with Pythagoras. He was omnipotent. And this specific book, the Liber Vacae, the Book of the Cow, it's a pseudo-Galenic / Platonic grimoire. And there are many different versions of it, because the way that they would, when you're writing a pseudo-Aristotelian or pseudo-Platonic, they're using the greatest minds of antiquity as a pen name. So to give it some validity or authenticity or something, but obviously we know that Plato wasn't writing about this. And the way it poses is Galen is writing on books of Plato in this book. And even the John Dee, the Elizabeth John Dee, had a copy of this book. And it doesn't surprise me, because he did have the biggest library in Europe at his time. So the fact that he had a copy of this book, you know, you could expect that, because again, he had a bunch of books. But what, go ahead.
English translations of this book, or is it pretty much only in Latin?
So there are some people have done some translations. I don't know their names right off the top of my head, but I could send you them. But yes, there are people who are translating it. Now, it went from Arabic to Latin. David Pingree did the Latin translation on it. And there are some other scholars who also translate it to English. But yeah, the thing is that what freaks me out about this is that it was never a printed book. It was never a published book. What it was a manuscript that usually 9 times out of 10 was written by hand on small pieces of paper. And what's scary about that is that whoever was copying this, it was very personal. They were there, heard, you know, in a rush, because if you were found with this at this time, you would be burned at the stake. You know what I mean? If you're talking about making a rational animal by penetrating an animal, bestiality, or using ingredients from a dead corpse, necromancy, you were going to be killed. You were not, you know, if you were exposed by this, you're dead. So whoever would copy it off of another version, and they would all do it by hand. So a lot of the copies that exist are written by hand, and that makes it that much more personal. So it's like, hey, I don't know what I'm writing down. No, you do know what you're writing down, because you're consciously copying it down by hand. So did John Dee write it down by hand and understood it? And it was like, okay, you can't mix this up. When you start to look into the experiments in this book, you can't mix it up. So what they would do is, there's other fragments as well of the Liber Vacae. And what they would do is they would take legitimate medical journals or books, and they would slip in a piece of the Liber Vacae to occult it, right? So I relate that to modern day, where they fuse fiction and reality. You have Crowley writing about the Moonchild, which is about a homunculus and a fictional story, but we know, like Lovecraft, he might have been writing about the occult in a story format in order not to suffer the repercussions of exposing these secrets. So they would take these medical journals and they would slip in there a piece of the Liber Vacae, and it would just keep on. They would have it in all these big libraries, and it would just slip on by. But the initiates, the people who know what to look for, you know, if you connect the dots XYZ, you know where to go to look for it. You understand me? So it's again, I link it to secret societies. I think this is the type of knowledge that they want to hide from us. Now, I get the question a lot: is the homunculus a real concept, or is it a metaphorical concept? Is it literal or metaphorical? I think it was both, and we'll get into it because there are two different versions of the homunculus. There's the metaphysical and there's the physical, and I think that both existed because if you're writing about these things, and the reason I don't think it was symbolic was because the Liber Vitae isn't an alchemical text per se, because with alchemy, as you understand, it's all written in symbols, right? The green lion eats the sun. Well, we know that's an alchemical reaction of the metals changing, and this it was quite literal there, and there was not a lot of symbolism. It was, you do this, A plus B equals C, so spontaneous generation. And so that aspect of it kind of freaked me out, where I'm like, okay, these people are copying it, they're conscious of what they're copying, and then they're putting it in and occulting it behind greater work, legitimate work. So let's just throw in this piece in here of the Liber Vitae to see what happens. Now I can send you some stuff after the show of where to look for it and stuff, but you're not going to find this on Audible or anything like that. I've had a bunch of people hit me up. They're like, hey, where can I find this? Where can I read about this? So
quick,
yeah.
what is there a date or a time frame of when the Liber Vitae was dated to?
Yeah, 9th century.
9th century.
AD.
Okay.
9th century AD.
And then is there any speculation as to who authored it?
That I could find, there is one name. He's Arabic. I don't know the name off the top of my head, but there is speculation on who might have been the person authoring this. And because it's referenced in the Picatrix, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Picatrix.
I've heard of that.
It's referenced in other grimoires, and they say, and there's another grimoire that they say that this Liber Vitae took its inspiration from. So again, it's, where do you want to focus in on? Because this goes back to as far as the 8th century BCE, this concept of the homunculus. So, and that relates to Taoism, where they were literally drinking tinctures of mercury to try and live forever. So just take that for, you know what I'm saying? Like, take that for a grain of salt. These guys were drinking mercury to try and live forever and mixing up all these concoctions trying to find the elixir of life. Again, I think that eventually, by somebody writing about this, the scary part is that when somebody writes about this and they put these recipes, there's always going to be that one Florida man that's going to try it for real. They're going to come on and be like, hey, I wonder what happens if I do this. And that's the scary part, because it goes from theoretical to the practical. And all these occultists were writing theoretically, or alchemists, they're writing theoretically, but also, where did that stem from? Were you trying it out yourself? So it's shaky ground as to if this is a real concept. I believe it is, and it transforms from like a scientific alchemical concept to a pseudo-scientific metaphysical type of thing. And we'll get to it, because even Crowley was writing about it. And the Liber Vitae, it's based off of, and I'll cover Aristotelian biology quickly later on, but there's a ritual that Virgil wrote about in his book Georgics called Begonia. And back then, the ancients believed that putrefaction brought forth life. So Paracelsus believed that the reason that the chicken was incubating the egg, she was warming it up in order to putrefy whatever was inside of that egg, and therefore it brought forth the life of the little chick. We now know that is not true. Obviously, it needs to be fertilized, but that's what they believed back then because of pure observation. So he's like, okay, this chicken is warming the egg up, so that's why you have the whole the flask when they warm it up and all that stuff. You have Faust and Mephistopheles making Wagner and Mephistopheles making the homunculus in the Faustian tale. They're warming it up in that alchemical flask. So they were 100% based off of observation. We didn't have microscopes back then. So it all goes back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras actually came up with spermism, and Aristotle took that and they developed their whole thing on it. And this book, the Begonia ritual, it is the generation, it's for the generation of bees. And what needed to be done was you took a baby cow, 2 years old, and you would beat it to a pulp, right? You would beat it and kill it and beat it into a pulp and let it sit. And from its carcass, after 40 days, you would come back and there would be bees would be born from the carcass of this cow. And then it got more specific. The carcass of a horse would breed hornets, or scorpions would come from the putrefaction of a spinal cord. Whatever, it would evolve throughout time. Because think about it, if they left a piece of meat rotting outside back then, they just killed something, they left it out, they came back, they're like, there's flies now. So by this meat putrefying, we get maggots. Then from that, we get the flies. So like, this is creating life. Putrefaction, the rotting of this thing is making new life. That's the way that they looked at it. And we see the parallels with the Liber Vitae and the Begonia ritual. And the Liber Vitae is broken up into a minor and a major. And there's roughly about 80 experiments. And some of them, which are really interesting, some of them are how to make plants grow in an hour, methods to make armies, giants, and other forms appear in the sky. So it makes me think of like Project Bluebeam. Is Project Bluebeam a magical thing, or are they using the Elon Musk's satellites up there? Like, what's going on with that? And then it also shows you how to construct different kinds of magical houses where people will suffer seizures, start to tremble, hallucinate, or die. And I'm on board with what people fail to recognize, that architecture plays such a major role in magical operations. A lot of people don't understand that, but we'll get into it in a little bit. And it instructs you how to be able to speak to birds or make lamps that can't be turned off. The minor section, according to the pseudo-Plato Galenic guy, he says that the minor stuff is like illusions, magic with a C, right? That's the whole thing with Crowley. It's like magic with a C, stage illusions, regular magic, how to make a lamp that doesn't turn off. It's exoteric. The guy says this is the more known to the public. And then the major section, the author says this is the more exoteric. This is the darker stuff. And it can be traced back to the 9th century, how I mentioned. And it goes by a bunch of different names. You have the Vitae Platonis, the Liber Aneguimus, the Liber Aggregatonium, the Legis Platonis. They have a whole bunch of different names for this book. And in order to, the reason it's named the Liber Vitae, it's because of the 4th experiment on there's 4 experiments, and it's the last one. And the first 3 are the ones on how to make the homunculus, the rational animal. And I'm going to start with the 4th one because that's the one that involves the cow, and it's the book of the cow. And so it starts off by this. The 4th experiment gives you the instruction on how to generate the bees. Now you start off by, similar to Begonia, you start off by taking the cow, building a house with 14 small windows on the eastern side. Now think about Crowley when he was doing the Abramelin ritual. It needed to be the bullskin house, on Loch Ness, facing a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. Again, architecture plays a major role. That's 14 small windows on the eastern side. Then you must seal all of them shut, behead the cow, drain all of its blood, and reattach the head back on the corpse of this cow, unfortunately. You then sew the mouth, eyes, ears, nose, anus, and vulva shut. So again, it becomes the hermetically sealed vessel. And this is similar to Virgil's version, where you need to beat it with whatever it is that you have. In this specific grimoire, the Liber Vitae, and this is, quote, take a big dog's penis and incessantly beat the cow with it until its flesh is discolored and its bone is broken. So that's the big kicker there. Like out of all, yeah, it's funny, right? Because I throw that in there and people are like, wait a minute, like, what are you saying? Well, that's what it said. Some scholars argue that it's a mistranslation. It's supposed to be bone. It's supposed to be, but again, the biggest dog penis, a big dog penis, and you incessantly beat it. So how do you go about doing that? I don't know, but you can relate this to Agrippa had a dog, and it has to do with familiars and how familiars are used in magical rituals. You had
what is a familiar?
So a familiar is like a companion, if you will. So a witch always has a black cat as a familiar, and the reason it was the devil incarnated or an entity incarnated. So you have Salvador Dali with his anteaters, right? He had an anteater. He would walk around with that. So maybe that was his familiar. Now, Agrippa allegedly practiced bestiality with his familiar, with his dog, who was said to be Satan. So he was having sex with his dog. So it gets really weird. And again, this is this is medieval grimoire magic. So this is why it's fascinating, because this type of stuff is all over the place. And it's like, wait a minute, these people were dead serious. And I believe it's traced back to the idea that there are, for a lack of a better term, glitches in the matrix. There are books in the Bible, verses in the Bible that tell you not to mix certain things together. You have Plato. It goes back to eugenics, which is traced back to Pythagoras, where certain people were able to commingle or breed. And there are, in the Bible, it tells you don't mix certain linens together, don't mix certain animals together, don't mix certain things together because of what I believe would be adverse reactions. And I do think that these are exposing, it's like a cheat code in the matrix. You know what I mean? Like that's what it is. It's a way to break out and glitch the program in a way. Like
I mean, imagine the first person that discovered popcorn. It's like you heat it up and it just poof, it creates something you would never even imagine. I figure there's probably all kinds of shit like that out there that we don't even know about.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly. It's like there were a lot of the things that were discovered by mistake. And then you add the deranged syndrome of a person, some crazy alchemist that's been working with mercury all his life and is dying of like mercury poisoning. And it's like, well, let me take my sperm and start mixing it in all these other things to see what happens. I mean, all right. So after the dog penis episode, you split the cow skin after 7 days and remove the marrow-like substance, which you must then grind up with an unknown herb. Now we're on the recipe to how to create bees. And you take that mixture, you put it in the corner of the house where it'll eventually become worms. And every day thereafter, you need to open a window, throw a handful of powdered bees at the worms until you have living bees. And if you do all that I said backwards, you get a living cow from dead bees. So
Alrighty.
So that's the generation of bees. That's the fourth experiment of the first. That's the last experiment of the first four in the major section. Now we're going to talk about the creation of the rational animal, which the rational animal can be attributed to the homunculus. And so this is 9th century, so they don't call it a homunculus. Now it starts off by saying whoever wishes to make a rational animal should take his own water while warm, so your sperm, and let him mix it with an equal measure of the stone that is called the stone of the sun. Again, kind of cryptic, but we don't really. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, what do you think that means, the stone of the sun?
So it continues on to say, this is a stone that shines at night like a lamp, but to the place in which it is found is illuminated. I think it's meteorite. I think it's what the Edward Kelly, allegedly what they were talking about, that the reason that they were never able to recreate the transmutation from lead to gold was because they were using this red powder of projection, which was actually grounded up meteorite. So I think it's meteorite. That's my personal opinion. So very cryptic. And now if this was, because this is around the time where they're getting into cryptography, being able to shroud their ideas with other symbolism and allegories. If this guy was trying to do that, I mean, you would have just done that. You wouldn't have been like, here, take the dark penis, whatever, do this X, Y, Z, right? It would have been more encrypted. I think that, again, it was meant to be taken literal. I think it was, if there is a key in order to decipher this text, it's lost forever. We're not ever going to be able to find that. But for the initiated, the people who were in these circles who knew what this meant, it might have been for something else. It might have been not for necessarily a material homunculus. It might have been for something else. Who knows? It might have been for whatever. That's the beauty of it, because you can interpret it and look at it from which way you want. And so I think personally it's meteorite. After this, you must take the cow or the ewe. Its vulva is cleansed with medicines and its womb made capable of receiving what is put in it. If a cow is used, the blood of the ewe is put on its vulva and vice versa. The orifice is then plugged with the stone of the sun. So you have this meteorite thing. After After this, the animal is put in a dark house, and every week it is given a pound of the other animal's blood to eat. One must then take some sunstone, as much sulfur, as much magnet, as much green tutia. He should grind them, mix them with willow sap, and dry in the shadows. So again, kind of cryptic, but again, it's a translation. When the cow or sheep gives birth, one must take that form and put it in that powder that you just finished concocting with the sunstone. And once you put it in, once you take this gelatinous thing, it's going to come out as a gelatinous thing. In some version, they say to form it into the shape of a man. So you take this marrow-like thing and you form it into a shape of a man, like Play-Doh. And then you dump it into this mixture. And from you putting it in this mixture, it grows. It is clothed. It said, for it will at once be clothed in human skin. Then it should be put into a great glass or lead vessel. After 3 days, it will become hungry. So it makes you think the 3 days of resurrection, the three symbolism. You had the Knights Templar allegedly putting people, taking them to the brink of death, drowning them and bringing them back to induce an out-of-body experience. So it's, again, very ritualistic, 3 days out of all the numbers. It will become hungry and will start to move around. Therefore, feed it from that blood that has gone forth from the mother for 7 days. So we have the 7 symbolism in there. Then the animal form that is agreeable to many miracles will be finished. The animal form that is agreeable to many miracles will be finished, because the whole aspect of the alchemical homunculus is that it's a magical little being. Now, this being can be used to change the course of the moon, change oneself into a cow or sheep. And if you take this form and feed it and nourish it for 40 days and feed it with blood and milk, nothing else, the sun does not see it. You may then vivisect it and use its fluids to anoint your feet, where you'll be able to walk on waters. So if you give it blood, milk, and leave it out of the sun, so it makes me think of a vampire who's just eating blood and milk, and you vivisect it, so you take all its fluids and you anoint your feet, you're going to be able to walk on water. Interesting thing to be able to do. And finally, if a man has raised it and nourished it until a whole year passes and left it in milk and rainwater, it will tell him all things that are absent. So that's also another medieval grimoire type of thing, where they would use entities or demons to tell them where hidden treasures are and things of that nature. You have that as well present. And David Pingree, which is a scholar and a researcher, he believed that the Liber Vacae was actually a recipe on how to create an artificial demon. He called it the most flagrantly demonic Arabic text ever to exist because of that. And there are various scholars who, Lynn Thorndike, for example, who wrote about this in his encyclopedia of, I have it somewhere on my, anyways, it was magic and experimental, alchemy and experimental magic, I believe is the encyclopedia. And he wrote about this in that encyclopedia, which is also another source material because he translated it. And he left some things out. He's like, this is too grotesque to leave this in here. I don't want to be associated with this. And whenever it would come to parts where he didn't want to write about it, he'd say some things are better left unsaid. And I'm paraphrasing that, but he says it in a scholarly type of way within the text. So it makes me think of all the things that maybe have been occulted or omitted from history, from people from another religion who pick these things up, and from a scholarly point of view, we're translating it or whatever it is, or even being a scholar with a religious point of view and not wanting to associate yourself with a translation of whatever sorts, and you omit a certain detail from it. So think about that next time you read any ancient scripture, or take things for 100% the truth. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to bash anybody's religions or anything, because I was born and raised Pentecostal Christian, and I do believe in God. I just don't subscribe to the dogmatic views of the church organized religion. That's just my personal opinion, but just something to keep in mind, because it is a real thing where things are left out on purpose, not by accident. And I think it's by design.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely something to it. It seems like there's probably a lot missing, though. There's probably some older texts that had this stuff laid out in full detail, and then over time it kind of just got diminished or something like that.
Yeah, not only that, but the books themselves were brought away. And think about the burning of the Library of Alexandria, where what was lost there? If you want to follow that mainstream narrative, what knowledge did the world lose by the burning of all this knowledge? So the next two experiments. So we covered the fourth one, which is the generation of bees, where you beat the cow with the dog dick. And we just mentioned we went back and did the first one, where it's the first homunculus recipe, and the next two are essentially the same, except the matrix, which means womb, is provided by one of them is provided by a female monkey, and the third by an unidentified animal. And an ointment made from the eyes and brain of the homunculus birthed by the monkey allows you to see spirits and demons, and drinking a brew made from its tongue allows you to talk to these entities. And this was the part where David Pingree talked about it being demonic, but this is also the only part where it involves any sort of entities. So demonic entities, whatever, spiritual entities. This is the only part that talks about that. So he associated it, it's demonic because of this one part. Using its liver makes trees bend over, using its brain and brain of a fresh human corpse on a dead tree can make it flourish instantly. Where you acquire those ingredients, use your imagination. Necromancy was a big thing during the medieval times, especially. There was the robbing of graves it went crazy because there was medicinal cannibalism, but that's a whole other episode. Using the guts of the homunculus birthed by the unidentified animal can make you impervious to pain. And the way you would do that, you would take the sword that you were going to take into battle or something like that, and you would anoint it with the guts of it, right? Some weird, so just weird stuff. Using its heart wrapped in skin of its forehead makes you invisible. Burning powder made from its body can make it rain. And finally, if you bury this powder in the ground for 14 days, the powder will give birth to extremely poisonous snakes. And then after that, you have other sets of experiments that were to generate hybrid animals. So what they called animals not ever seen before. And I think what they were trying to do, so you'd have a cow with the face of a human, viper-like worms with horns and enormous eyes, bee-like worms, and a final animal that if you use its fat as an ointment, you can permanently transform a person into a pig or an ape. And that makes me think about how if you were using that to turn somebody else into a pig or an ape, if you would use them for the homunculus recipe. So it's like it gets really dark. It's like, I'm gonna curse you and then I'm gonna use you for the same ritual.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Again, that's just as the experiments progress, it's just a mixture of more and more animal and human substances and mixtures of various matrices. So they were going haywire. They were like, all right, let's mix it with this, let's mix it with that. And I mentioned David Pingree considered the Liber Reiki the most flagrantly demonic of the Arabic books on magic, and he considered the homunculus an artificial demon. Now, ultimately, the purpose for these recipes and these experiments, whatever you want to call them, was for the magician or the practitioner to gain godlike powers. So the idea of having this magical being that you could use, and I think that when we always talk about alchemy, we always relate it to the transmutation of lead into gold, or turning things into gold, the elixir of life. You have the stories of Count of Saint Germain and these immortal alchemists. You have Fulcanelli, you have all these guys, Nicholas Flamel. I think that the actual goal of alchemy was to make artificial life, to do this, to get to this thing, because what better way than to emulate the Godhead, the God, than by creating your own life, becoming that Promethean, the modern Prometheus, right? The Frankenstein, the modern, where you make life and you are able to control. And then it's like a little perk on top of that. It's like, well, I created life and he's magical. If you think about the leprechaun could be considered a homunculus because it's a little man that leads you to what? It's alchemical, to the gold. So I'm not going to waste my time mixing mercury and all these things in order to make gold when I can just make a magical being that's going to lead me to the gold. Yeah. What better way?
Yeah, it reminds me also of, there's the biblical, making man from clay or whatever. And then there's also the Mesopotamian creation myths with like the Anunnaki and all that. And then you kind of look back at a lot of the different like relics from that time, and you do see like a lot of these like half animal, half men like things. And I don't know, maybe it's just art, but it kind of
it's
makes you
related to
wonder.
this though.
Yeah.
It's related to the homunculus. Now, that was the Liber Vacay, and that's really the kicker when it comes to all this. But there's also some other things that I relate into it, and how you're saying, right? The magical process. Man is usually formed from either dust or clay. You nailed it. The story of the Anunnaki. Man is, they take the seed of a Homo sapien type-esque being, and they inject it into the matrix, the womb of the Anunnaki woman, and it gives birth to the slave race. So if you want to follow that cosmology, that story of creation, we are homunculus, right? At the end of the day, we're this artificially grown thing. And it's funny because what did I just mention about the leprechaun? The Anunnaki created man to do what? To mine for gold. So it goes back to this idea of the leprechaun, this little miniature man, to lead you to the end of the rainbow of like, hey, let's find the gold. And now you're gonna, so the Anunnaki made man in order to mine the gold. So kind of weird. And what did Yahweh, God, El, whoever, make Adam and Eve for? To till the land, right? To harvest from the land, maybe to dig for some sort of gold. I don't know. But that's what he was formed from. He was formed from the dust of the ground and had breathed life into its nostrils. In Greek cosmology, you have Prometheus shaped man out of mud. Athena breathed life into the clay figure. So again, it goes back to all these stories of creation. It starts off with some sort of artificially magical purpose, magical creation. Now, the ultimate power that God has is the ability to create life from nothing, right? What God giveth, God taketh. And nowadays we have the technology to edit or even clone DNA, but that comes with its ethical debates. And I didn't know that the first human clone was created in November of 1998. And check this out. The embryo was destroyed after 12 days, allegedly. 12 out of all the numbers. 12 days. So they claim. And the chimera they created was half man and half cow. So back to the cow for some reason. Again, it could be genetics. They say pigs are the anatomy of a pig most closely resembles a human. There's also conspiracies that pigs were also humans, and they, you know what I mean, like that they feed you this cannibalistic thing. There's a whole bunch of conspiracies you can follow when it comes to this. And I also want to note that cloning is illegal in a lot of countries. If something that can't be done, why would you care to make it illegal if it can't be done? You know what I mean? If it's science fiction and all these movies, Attack of the Clones, literally Star Wars puts it right out there. The OG homunculus, the clones from Star Wars. If they put it out there, you know, hey, to make it illegal, well, it means it can be done. So
like it's illegal to talk to fairies or something.
Yeah, like there's all these laws that make you think like, wait a minute, it's like there's a reason that sign on the highway is there to not do that one thing that it says because some guy tried to do it already. So we have one of the OGs, because this idea of the homunculus, the original homunculus, is what everybody's seen. The voodoo doll, the clay figure, the doll made out of straw. It's sympathetic magic, it's image magic. That's the OG homunculus, a representation of man. And by using this image of a man and you invoke it with the energies of the person, you're able to manipulate this straw thing, this little doll, and you're able to make something happen in real life. So sympathetically, you're able to, the way you affect this doll affects the person in real life. And that actually has to do with Paracelsus. Paracelsus wrote a lot about this. And you have stories, Pygmalion, he created sculptures and fell in love with them. So this idea of man making inanimate object and giving it some sort of life. Back then, they would marry statues, by the way, during Greek times. And then you have the whole the Dahmer thing as of recently, where he took the mannequin. Everybody was freaking out about that. So I think that has to do with and I'm in the boat where these magicians, these magicians, these occultists of today, they are about invoking certain types of energies, and they worship gods that are different from the gods that we're used to in the mainstream. You know what I mean? They're it's the dark arts type of thing. And again, you could worship Cthulhu for all I care, as long as you don't hurt yourself or others. Whatever happens between two consenting adults, have at it, right? It's just when things start to get, you know what I mean? Like, just, you could practice freedom of religion all you want. Just don't force your ideologies on me.
What were some of the things that Paracelsus had been associated with? Did you say he was associated with like the voodoo doll type thing, or?
Yeah, so I have it here. So homunculus comes from the Latin term and translates to little man or miniature human. It is a representation of a small human being, originally depicted as a small statue made of clay. And according to Paracelsus, who I have a whole section on, this is quote, is the homunculus is the image or figure of a small man with every limb and shape like a man. It is based on the idea that the external shape and form of an object reveals in its internal properties and powers. Thus, the homunculus as an image of man possesses all abilities and powers of man. For a hidden human nature is concealed in it in a spiritual way. So again, image magic, where, as above, so below, they thought that this small thing, the micro, would affect the macro, which is man. And it is thus possible for this image to perform all operations of man completely. And that's Paracelsus. Because, and not to get too convoluted, but there are different versions, there are different subcategories of homunculus. You have the magical, you have the pathological, you have the alchemical, you have the simulacrum of man. So there's different, again, this topic, dude, when I first started looking into it, it just blew my mind because I didn't know where to start, because it goes so deep. But essentially, the OG homunculus is the simulacra of a man or person made of earth, wax, or metal. The doll. It makes you think of the Bohemian Grove. They were burning that effigy of that person, of a person, of what is said to be, the shape of a person. And obviously all the voodoo dolls that we see in movies, where they take the hair of a person and they fuse in, they poke the pinholes in its heart and all this stuff. There's also one of the other definitions of homunculus is an artificial human created by magic. A homunculus does the bidding of its creator. And this is how you get the idea of the golem, the Jewish golem, Frankenstein, AI, cybernetics. It links all into that. Those are also forms of homunculus. In psychology, you have the homunculus argument, which they propose that within your head, there was a little homunculus watching your vision, what you're watching. But then they were like, what's in that homunculus's head? So it was homunculus all the way down ad infinitum within your head. So it's like it's a fallacy, because it's like, wait a minute, it's infinity. Then if there's homunculus in your head, yeah. So the very phenomenon explains the phenomenon. So it's like, wait, that you can't really talk about that. In neuroanatomy, you have the cortical homunculus, which I'm sure you've seen that, which is the statue of the weird shaped man with big lips and the big hands, and that is used as a neurological map of the brain and the parts of the body it controls. And of course, the one that everybody loves is the 16th century homunculus, which is the alchemical homunculus. And alchemy, as you know, was a philosophical art, magical process of transformation, creation, or combination, spagyrics and all this stuff that you mentioned earlier. And a homunculus is one of the beings that alchemists were rumored to have successfully created, artificially create life through the art of alchemy. And this concept comes from the idea, so the history of where this came from. was the idea of preformationism, where they believed back then, again, they didn't have microscopes, that in order for you to get a big, the big version of anything existed in the small version. So essentially, they thought that there was a little man like this crumpled up in the sperm. And when it would be injected into the womb and grow, it was a little version, a homunculus, little version, and it would just grow into a big man. That's what they thought. That's preformationism. So everything already exists as a miniature version of itself. And then we have Daddy Pythagoras, who is accredited to originating the term spermism. And spermism is the idea that the father contributes all the essential characteristics of the offspring, again, while the mother only contributes a material substrate. And I know that's kind of misogynist, and we know that's not the truth now, but the scary part about this is that Aristotle agreed with Pythagoras, and he elaborated on this concept, which lasted well into the 18th century, which was not that long ago. Now it transformed here and there, you know, from the beginning, obviously, to now, but Aristotelian biology ruled for a very long time. And it was, how I mentioned earlier, there was two aspects of it. There was spontaneous generation and sexual generation. And spontaneous was A plus B equals C. So triggered at will by mixing the correct natural ingredients and allowing them to putrefy. Putrefaction obviously plays a big role when it comes into all this, because they believe that that brought forth life. That's the whole idea of the phoenix, right? The rebirth, that cycle, you know, from its ashes rises the phoenix, dies, and it's the Ouroboros. So you have that alchemical symbolism in there as well. And I mentioned earlier the chick that came into existence by the putrefaction of the gelatinous material within that egg, because obviously the chicken was warming it up in order to putrefy even quicker. And we covered begonia, where there was the ritual to generate bees. It makes me think of Save the Bees, the whole narrative of Save the Bees or else we're going to die. And that whole begonia thing, a lot of scholars claim that it was more of a poetic merit, the way it's written. If you want to look it up online, the begonia ritual by Virgil. And it's written very poetic. So a lot of guys were like, hey, this is symbolic. Don't do it. But you know, there's that one Florida man who's going to actually beat his cow to death and see what happens.
That Epstein.
You know what I mean? So, yeah, and exactly. And Epstein, who's going to go ahead and try and do it because just to see what happens. Aristotle explained lice or itch mites, what they called, on pure observation. When they would see these pimples pop and the lice come out of it, they're like, hey, the body is creating it. It's coming out of the body is too moist. So that's where the lice come from. We know that's not the truth now. But sexual generation was that every material substrate must contain matter and form. And those two forms are sperm and menstrual blood. And back then they viewed sperm as like this foamy, godlike substance that was just the nectar. That was the most important thing. It was what everything came, which, I mean, without sperm, we wouldn't be here, but also without women. So it's an alchemical marriage. You know what I mean? You need both in order for life to exist. But this is the way that they thought back then. And the sperm acts as a form to the matter supplied by the menstrual blood in order to produce a living being. And Aristotle believed that coitus, so our intercourse, there was a conflict between the sperm and the menstrual blood. And the way that they were duking it out. And now if the sperm one, you would have a male, and if the menstrual blood one, you would have a female. That's how they attributed the genders to, and at this time there was only two genders for those, you know, if you, that's how they would attribute that back then. Again, they were products of their time, and you see the ideas evolve. Now, Aristotle stated females are weaker and colder in nature than males, and we should look upon the female state as being as it were a deformity. Now he states weaker and colder temperature wise as well. So because of the absence of a sexual appendage, this further proved that women lack perfection. Again, products of their time. And Giles of Rome compares the sperm to a carpenter and the menstrual blood to wood. And women were essentially just seen as a vessel, as an incubator for the sperm, unfortunately. But we now know that's not the truth. Yeah, it's rough out here. So we have here the Aristotle did not believe that human beings could be born without both parents, but his followers, again, everybody after him, they did not discriminate when it came to heretical ideas. And because of the power that was given to the sperm, claiming that it was the cause of giants and other monstrosities, that's why I say it's related to cryptids and all this stuff, and we'll get to that later. People started to think like, hey, what happens if I mix it into this cow? Or what happens if I mix it into this horse? Or what happens if I mix it into this goat, into any other matrix, a vessel, a alchemical vessel? Let's see what happens when I put it in there. And now that's how you get the alchemical homunculus. Now, I want to talk about my favorite version of the alchemical homunculus, or the idea of the concept of a homunculus. And it's the one that has to do with Chinese alchemy, which is known as internal alchemy, the Taoist or Taoist. And it's considered the little golden, the golden little man. And essentially, Taoist alchemy can be traced back up to as far back as the 8th century BCE. And there is a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower that speaks of a body a body outside of your body, this immortal spirit body. And Taoism is all about meditation, breathing, and they stated that if you're able to reverse, so you have energy flowing out of your body, and if you're able to reverse what they called the light, if you're able to reverse this light through meditation, after 100 days or so, you're able to reverse this light back into itself. That energy will crystallize and form a little golden man within your own body. And the purpose of this little golden man was to live for you after your death in order for you to escape samsara reincarnation. So it makes me think of these, and I forget the name off the top of my head, but the monks who mummify themselves from the inside out for 3 years, and they encapsulate themselves in golden statues. There was a statue that was on display for a while at a museum, and when they x-rayed it, there was actually the body of a monk inside of it. And it makes me think, again, was it an actual physical thing, or was it a metaphysical aspect? But they believe that by you reversing this flow of energy outside of, within your body, and reverse it for long enough that it will crystallize. And they call it, the way has no name or form. It is just essence, just the primal spirit. And it says here, from the point of view of the universe, people are like mayflies, but from the point of view of the way, even the universe is as an evanescent reflection. Only the true essence of the original spirit transcends the primal organization and is above it. So again, through meditation, semen retention, all these different things, you were able to, because what they believed was, if there's a miniature version of myself, which I'm a spiritual being, and I'm speaking in metaphorically here, for the conversation. What they believe was, if I'm spiritual and I'm this powerful being, well, within my sperm, there's another little human, and then inside of that human, there's another human. So if I'm spreading that seed everywhere, I'm going to use that, and I'm going to turn that around and use it for myself, for my own spiritual ascension. So that's why they practice abstinence and all. That's why you see monks who practice abstinence, because it's about the semen retention and using that for magical purposes, manifestation, et cetera, et cetera. And that also has to do with tantric sex magic, where they use, again, sperm and all these things for magical purposes, to charge talismans, et cetera, et cetera. And it makes me think, I just finished watching this show on Netflix, Love is Blind, where one of the contestants on that show, again, to show that they put these things out there in the media by the cinemagicians, one of the contestants was boasting about practicing tantric, what he called transcendental sex or something like that, where you're able to orgasm without ejaculation. He was boasting about it on the show, like, hey, yeah, I'm able to have sex and I don't ejaculate. So, and that's used because, again, sex magic, they believe that at the point of orgasm, you are at one with the universe, and your subconscious comes forward. You're able to imprint things on that subconscious, and it'll come down and it'll manifest in some sort of way in the ether.
Yeah.
And they have this on Netflix, on one of the most popular shows that there is.
That part actually doesn't seem too that part doesn't seem too unrealistic to me. As far as the golden being part, so is this like from a primary source text, or was this in multiple texts in Taoism or?
No, so you can find this on The Secret of the Golden Flower, and I can send you a copy of that too. It's a book from the 17th century, I want to say.
Secret of the Golden Flower. Okay.
Yes, The Secret of the Golden Flower. It's got to do, again, you could read it. It's a quick read, and it's open for interpretation. You know what I mean? There has been various translations on it and also various commentaries on it. So, but it talks about a spirit outside of the spirit that crystallizes, and the color gold signifies XYZ. There's a whole bunch of different things to it, but yeah, The Secret of the Golden Flower. And Carl Jung was obsessed with this. Carl Jung was obsessed with alchemy, and he attributed this being as like the shadow self. We all have this homunculus within ourselves that is able to show us the way, if you're able to tap into that in some.
Actually, speaking literally.
That's the beauty. That's the beauty of it, dude, because the truth is stranger than fiction.
Right.
And I think you can approach it from two different ways. I do think that certain things are meant to be interpreted literally and others metaphorically. And in this aspect, I think that it was both. I think you have this more metaphysical homunculus, the golden little man, and then you have the alchemical chimera, which, if you think about, for example, ayahuasca, and how people say that that's the code to breaking out of the matrix, et cetera, et cetera. My argument to that is maybe it could be DMT, maybe it could be the way out, but think about all the chemical compounds and mixtures that we don't know about. You know how many species of plants there are in the rainforest, and how many, if you ask a shaman, ayahuasquero, how they came across this mixture, they'll tell you that the plants told them to mix these two things together. But imagine of all the stuff that we don't know about, right? If they are able to fertilize an egg outside the womb of a woman that is later put into the woman, and it grows into a human being, think about all the other possibilities that are able to happen.
Far-fetched to imagine that you could incubate that within another vessel.
And there's this Russian guy on YouTube, and I'm sure people have come across it, where he follows, and again, it's fake, right? The videos are fake, or so they say, but he takes these eggs and he cuts the top of them off, and he injects his sperm into them. And he shows it later on after he let it sit in a closet for X amount of time. And he takes out this moving thing with appendages, and like people were freaking out. Like, he has a whole series. I'll send you the YouTube videos. There's a whole series of homunculus, like homunculus 1, 2, 3, 4, like up to like 20 something or something like that. And I have a friend of mine who has a friend that lives in Russia, and he helped us translate the video. And he's like, yeah, this guy's talking about like how to do it. You take this, you take that, you mix it up, and you have a homunculus. So I don't want to say it's not possible to make this thing, and I also don't want to say that it is possible, right? I think it's really interesting, and I like talking about it. Am I ever going to know the truth? Probably not. You know what I mean?
I feel like it's definitely possible. How? I don't know. I think that there's clues in these texts. I think there's definitely, in the right temperature and conditions and circumstances of some kind of womb, it would have to be at least compatible in some way. But I feel like it is possible. I don't know if it's been done or what, but.
And if you take just the idea of making a regular human being, how crazy that concept is, like something that comes out of my body into somebody else's body, and it makes a freaking person inside of their body. That in itself is crazy. You know what I mean? Like that could be considered fiction or pseudo whatever for a while. Imagine the first people to try and do that. Or like, what just happened?
Yeah.
Like what just happened? That was a crazy experience for them until it was normalized. And I think that's what happens with this concept, that it's put in this fiction. They indoctrinate you to believe like, oh, it's pseudoscience, it's science fiction. Look at all these movies and all this stuff. And again, back to the making stories to occult true events. You have the story of Mary Shelley and the modern Prometheus of Frankenstein. Allegedly, her husband was reading these sort of texts, was obsessed with alchemy, and that story was inspired by this other guy, which I haven't pulled up here somewhere, that lived in this castle, and allegedly that's again inspired by Johann Conrad Dippel, which was a German pious theologian, physician, alchemist, and occultist, and he was born at Castle Frankenstein. So they say that this was the guy that was the inspiration for Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Again, but that's just another hypothesis that people want to talk about. But I do believe that these occultists do that. That's what all these movies are. They're invoking, different. You see all the tarot symbolism in these movies, and I think it's about invoking that imagery and invoking that energy. So we have the Zosimos of Panopolis, which was with the first mention of a homunculus, or what scholars consider a pseudo homunculus. But Zosimos is this really enigmatic alchemist, Greco-Egyptian alchemist. He was a Gnostic mystic, and he lived towards the end of the third, beginning of the 4th century AD. So I'm painting this picture. So we're at the 3rd, 4th century AD, and he wrote the oldest known literature on alchemy, which I'm not going to try and say the name, but it's a Greek for things made by hand. And although Zosimos' homunculus is not our traditional alchemical homunculus, it's a version of it. And the part is he's having these series of dreams where it's almost like he's going through this hellscape. It makes me think of Dante's Inferno. And he comes across this priest that's in an alchemical vessel. And this is what he says. And as he was saying these things, and I was pressing him to talk, his eyes became like blood, and he vomited forth his flesh. So very Lovecraftian, horror-esque story where this guy's vomiting his flesh up. And I saw him change into a mutilated anthroparion, biting himself and wounding himself with his own teeth. Seized with fear, I thought, it is not thus that the composition of waters is produced. And I was convinced that I had understood well. So again, this is an alchemical text, which this one we can attribute to the chemical reaction of metals. But the anthroparion, that is the one that people relate to the homunculus. And Carl Jung talked about this one. He said that this was the first representation of the idea of the homunculus, the first one ever written down in a book. Now, alchemy for Zosimos was a religious experience. They wanted to remove the impurity of matter, and the goal was to resurrect the material world. So by affecting this material, you were able to affect the greater reality in a way. So quantum physics, quantum tunneling, quantum entanglement, whatever, the spooky, what is it called? The spooky action at a distance, or whatever you want to call it. And Fulcanelli puts it beautifully. The secret of alchemy is this: there is a way of manipulating matter and energy as to produce what modern scientists call a field of force. The field acts on the observer and puts him in a privileged position vis-a-vis the universe. From this position, he has access to realities which are ordinarily hidden from us by time and space, matter and energy. This is what we call the great work, the magnum opus. So that's Fulcanelli, one of the more modern day alchemists, which talked about nuclear energy pretty much before it was a thing. And he talks about, again, affecting material matter to invoke this other thing above that. And I think that's what magic is to me, where you're able to, again, find a glitch in the matrix to invoke that placebo effect, finding a way, a kundalini, a meditation in order to invoke a biological change within your body. You have churches where they attribute the miracles in those churches to the architecture. This area, this this building was able to invoke a biological change within that person. So that's what I consider magic to be.
I mean, it makes sense to me just from like an acoustics perspective. If you think about like a cathedral with the organ pipes and, you know, specific frequencies kind of, and how those may affect somebody at the cellular level, I can imagine that that would definitely potentially have some kind of healing effect or harming effect, depending on how it's tuned and all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. It's got to do with the frequencies and cymatics and all these stuff. And trying to find here the Jabir bin Hayyan. So this, again, the people who were messing with this sort of stuff were some of the greatest minds of antiquity. And Jabir bin Hayyan, which is referred to as the father of modern chemistry, he went by many names, Gerber in Europe, and some other names. He had various names, and he was an 8th century Persian sage, referred to as the father of modern chemistry. And he is believed to be the first scientist who made alchemy into an experimental science of the time. And one of the things, this guy is the one that invented the acid that goes in your battery that goes in your car. So this guy has been attributed to a lot of works. He authored, allegedly, more than 3,000 research articles and treatises in his life, and more than 70 books are translated into other languages. And there's some debate whether this guy was actually legit or not, because that is a lot of research articles. And I attribute him to maybe he was one of these immortal alchemists, right? That changed, since he had so many names, and I don't have the names pulled up here, but he had other different names. And again, I write about this in my journal. I put quotes in there that I obviously don't say on air because it takes up too much time. I cite sources. I do all that in that journal for the people who want to get straight to the facts and want to do a little bit deeper digging, because obviously a time constraints on these podcasts, we can't really get into all the specifics. But I do write about Jabir bin Hayyan on there and other things. And this guy he wrote on instructions on how to artificially recreate, so emulate products of nature, such as precious metals, stones, plants, animals, and you guessed it, man. And let me see if I can find the other one, because I was editing my journal and I have his thing pulled up on my grammar. Give me 1 second to pull this up, because I have in there the goal of these Muslim alchemists. They had a different goal. They all had their own goals. And so here we go. So the goal of certain Muslim alchemists was called takwin. And takwin refers to the creation of artificial life in a laboratory, up to and including human life. And the most notable that was known of the Muslim alchemist was Jabir bin Hayyan. And he was a prolific writer, I said, and this guy made something that I refer to as the homunculus rotisserie machine. And the way that he made his homunculus was he would take this mold in the shape of a man. Depending on the size and shape of it would determine the outcome of the homunculus, but he would fill it up, put the sperm in it, all this stuff, and he created this machine that it was half spheres concentric. So it was like this contraption that's just like spinning in on itself, and the mold was put in the center of this, and it was supposed to mimic the cosmic system. Depending on the shape and size of the mold determined the outcome of the homunculus. And they varied from a young girl with a boy's face to an adolescent with the intelligence of a man. And Hayyan goes on to describe different schools' methods. So what he was hinting at was, hey, there are different ways to do this, that you can get different outcomes depending on which school of thought you follow. So for example, if you wanted to create a winged man, you would take the sperm of a bird and of a human, and you would mix it together. So you have a winged man. And again, he believed that he was doing God's work because he was using what I mentioned earlier, magia naturalis, so natural magic, where you're using things in nature. You're using what's already out there available to you. As long as you're not using outside entities to influence the outcome, you're good. You're all right. So Kathleen Malone O'Connor writes, from the emic perspective of the alchemist, the act of talking was an emulation of the divine creative and life-giving powers of Genesis and resurrection, and tapped the physical and spiritual forces in nature. At the same time, it was an act through which the alchemist was inwardly transformed and purified, a spiritual regeneration. So again, they thought by doing the great work, they were ascending themselves. And that's where you get the whole immortal alchemist concept, which is a whole nother episode because I have a whole thing on that. And such an act highlights the creative and often uneasy interrelationship of Islamic magic and science with Islamic revelation and tradition. And it disturbs me to think about how these great minds of antiquity were involved in what was considered the occult during their time. Maybe it was a little bit more normalized until religion started to catch on. But if the elites of this time were doing this and dabbling in these sorts of things, makes you think what the elites of today are dabbling in, or what they're not dabbling. You know what I mean? So again, that's the aspect that really freaks me out. Like, all right, that's really weird. And to continue here as we approach the end, the Jewish golem is a version of the homunculus. So it's not a traditional homunculus, but certain scholars, such as Walter Pagel, argues that the story of the golem may have been the predecessor of the homunculus of Paracelsus. And the golem is more of an automata, and you can relate that to the robotics, AI. The traditional AI takes over and destroys man, the Terminator, the machines go out of control. And the Golem of Prague is my personal favorite and one of the more famous stories of the Golem. And it's the Golem is of Jewish literature, and it's a man brought to life by means of religious magic. Now, the story of the Golem of Prague, you have Rudolph II, and obviously you have the connection with John Dee and the connection with Jack Parsons here as well, which we'll get to. But the 16th century Rabbi Judai Lo Ben Bezalel, whom created the golem out of clay to defend the Jewish ghettos from the anti-Semitic attacks of Rudolph II. And essentially is a story of the magical power of the Hebrew language. You have the Tetragrammaton and all that stuff in there. And its origins can be traced back to the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a book attributed to the biblical Abraham. Now, and this is the way that, again, language can affect reality. So you have Kabbalah and all these things in there. And the story goes that this rabbi, the word emet, meaning truth, was written on the golem's forehead. And every Sabbath, in order to let the golem rest, the E would have been erased to form met, meaning death. So you have this rebirth, the phoenix. Every night it dies, it's reborn in the morning to serve its purpose, dies at night. And one night, Rabbi Lo forgot to do this, and the golem went on a rampage, started killing everybody in the ghetto. And there are various versions of the story where one of them, the golem gets so big, it's growing. The rabbi is able to erase the letter, and when the golem dies, it crushes the rabbi and kills him. And then there's other ones like this one where he kills the golem and they stuff its body in the attic of a church where it remained for centuries. And the reason this is related to Jack Parsons, not only did Jack Parsons try to create his own homunculus, which was a woman, but the guy that he was at JPL with, at Galsip, his professor, which his name is escaping me at the moment, he boasted about being related and having a lineage to this Rabbi Judai Lo, the famous alchemist or a rabbi that created the golem in Prague. So he would boast about it. And again, this was the mentor to Jack Parsons. He was with him at JPL in Galsip. So weird connection there. And I don't know if you want to talk about Jesus the homunculus or not, but all right. So this is the one that triggers people the most, aside from the dog dicks and everything. But
that's the best part.
There was a shout out to homie Romy from Rising from the Ashes, because we do these shows where we really go off the wall and we dive off the deep end sometimes. And I'll be honest, sometimes I say some things that, again, from assumptions and from ideas of all the research that I've done, And we say weird things like, hey, Jesus was a homunculus, and you just never bring it back up. Well, again, in the dark corners of the interwebs and of this esotericism and this occult topic, I came across just that. There was a 15th century theologian, Alonso Tostado, who was arguing at his time since the 15th century. Mind you, this is not my research. This is not an idea that I came up with. This is I came across on my research. But Tostado proposed that Mary was a sealed vessel. Again, a variation from our traditional homunculus, because there's no sperm. But Mary did have menstrual blood, and she did have a womb. So Tostado argued that Mary would not have had enough blood for the full development of Jesus in the womb. Therefore, he would have been condensed into a miniature version of a baby. So according to Aristotelian biology and the alchemical process, if you want to follow that, Jesus was conceived as a homunculus, a miniature human kept in a sealed vessel from the first instant of creation. Now, Thomas Aquina, which was another theologian of the time, they were going back and forth. Like, hey, that's not true. The reason that there was no need for sperm is because the Holy Spirit is indefinitely powerful and could fashion matter in any form instantly. So he was not a homunculus according to Aquino, but according to Tostado, he was. So you have that aspect of it. And you also back then had the idea that incubuses and succubuses could steal sperm and impregnate people. And you have the idea of Merlin the wizard from the author legend, where he was born from a demon. His mother was raped by a demon, and that's why he was, I guess, a demon, something half demon, half man, I guess. So that's why he was able to have these powers. And that idea that succubus or incubus were stealing sperm of men and putting into other people was an actual thing. Now, is he hinting at that in this, that maybe a demon stole the sperm and put it into Mary? Who knows? But there's also that argument that can be made. Again, not my idea, something of the time, thanks to Paracelsus and all of them.
So in this case, Jesus would have been like the good version of a homunculus, like a non-demonic version, I guess.
Yes, which Jabir bin Hayyan also said that. He said, hey, any other rational animal or creation or imitation of man is demonic, but I'm going to show you how to make a non-demonic one, one that is good. Okay. And I further took this because in medieval art, baby Jesus is portrayed as a homunculus. The literal definition of the word homunculus means miniature version of man or little man. And in medieval art, baby Jesus is portrayed as a little man. The reason for that being was because they said, hey, this is the Messiah. This is our savior. This is the guy who's going to save humanity. People aren't going to want to trust a baby. Yeah. So we have to give him some charisma. We have to give him some prestige. So let's draw him as a more sophisticated version. So you have paintings of the 15th century, 16th century around there, where Jesus was a little man with his hair done, in the little robe with a scroll in his hand, and he has like a 5 o'clock shadow. In other ones, he's ripped. He's like got abs and everything, and it's like a little Joe Rogan. And that's art. That's history. I'm not even making that up. That you can look it up. That's wild. So,
also, there's a thing you mentioned about the walking on water thing with the other homunculus. That's kind of a little tie-in.
Well, it brings me to my next conclusion, where the homunculus, and I'm not advocating for anything here, but according to these texts, the homunculus needs to be destroyed in order to unlock the magical powers of it. And we'll get to what happens if you don't destroy it. But in order for you to, similar to the golem, where it needs to be destroyed at the end of the night, and the story of Christian Rosencreutz, the chemical wedding of it's a Rosicrucian text. It's the alchemical bird, right? The chemical wedding, the rebirth. The bird is freed, by the way. In that story, they literally refer to the bird being freed, and that's the whole thing with Elon Musk when he tweeted, "The bird is freed." So again, these guys are practicing alchemy in real time. right in front of everybody's eyes, and people just turn a blind eye towards it. But this idea of having to destroy the homunculus in order to invoke or use its powers, well, I think that's why Jesus was, again, I come from a Christian background, he was killed, he was crucified, he was in order to use its powers, and then he was cannibalized after the fact with transubstantiation, where they, in the Eucharist, you literally eat of the body and blood of Christ. Well, what do you use in the homunculus? Oh, you need to use their body and their blood for magical purposes. Well, what is the Eucharist? Well, it's another ritual that you do in order to ascend, right? It's got a magical purpose, whether you like it or not. And that's my personal twist on that, touch on there, where he is cannibalized, he is killed after the fact in order to redeem everybody of their sins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's part of the whole aspect of Jesus as a homunculus. Now, take that for what you will, but like I said, it's not my idea. It was somebody else's idea, and I just took it and I put it in here. So
I think it's interesting.
It's really, yeah, it's super interesting. It's really interesting. It is. And finally, we get to the Paracelsian homunculus. So the person who birthed the figuratively and literally birthed the homunculus, and it's the 16th century German Swiss physician and alchemist who established the role of chemistry and medicine. A lot of things he was also a surgeon, so a lot of things that we use in modern surgery are attributed to Paracelsus. Now, Paracelsus we can do a whole episode on him alone. His original name is Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, and he was obviously dubbed Paracelsus because that was too long. He is considered the father of toxicology, and he was the one that came up with the dose makes the poison. Now, this is the guy that it's attributed to, hey, if you take too much of this medicine, you're going to die. And if you take too little bit of it, you're going to die. But also, if you take just the right amount, you're healed. So thanks to this guy for that. And he was also making homunculus and basilisks and what he considered Paracelsian monsters. Now, the homunculus to Paracelsus, because you also get into the ethical aspects of the homunculus. And Tostado talked, to back up a little bit, Alonso Tostado talked about the Arnaldian homunculus. And Arnaldus de Villanova, he was this theologian, again, church guy, alchemist, occultist, whatever. And he was making homunculus. And he would make homunculus, and as they were born, he would destroy them. And the reason for that being was because he would propose these ideas of, hey, did God die? Did Jesus die for the sins of this homunculus? Does this homunculus have a soul, or is it a vessel? I don't know what's going to happen if I let this thing live. So before God can invoke it with a soul, or a demon can take it over because it is a vessel, and that'll play a role into the Crowleyan homunculus, I'm going to destroy it. So this guy was making alchemical homunculus, and as soon as they would come to life, he said that he would smash them and kill them. To Paracelsus, the homunculus was the pinnacle of man's creative power, the idea that man could become God. And in 1572, physician Adam von Bodenstein, he published a book that was supposedly written based off the works of Paracelsus. So it was posthumously published, De Natura Rerum, the nature of things. I believe that's what it translates to. And in this book, there is an argument that things are either created by means of nature, without art, or with the aid of art, which is alchemy. And he talks about this. Paracelsus is the one that brings up the argument of the egg and the chicken, where the process of it. And then he talks about how he goes on to say that the death and rebirth of the bird is the highest and greatest mystery of God, the highest and secret and wonder work. He goes on to say a whole bunch of, mind you, I just want to point out that Paracelsus was also a drunk. and he was 5'2", a deformed looking man. So he might have been a homunculus himself. He hated women. He would do, again, this guy deserves his own episode. He would do public book burnings on the physicians that wouldn't agree with him or he didn't like. He would publicly burn their books, and he was just this show. He was just doing all this show. He was a very charismatic character. He was the typical mad scientist where they're always cranky. Don't bother me. When you bother them, they get angry. This was Paracelsus. And it could be attributed to a lot of things. They allegedly have his skeleton, and they did some tests on it. Obviously, he had some disease that doesn't come to mind at the moment, but he had high levels of mercury and all this stuff. Again, this crazy alchemist that was there, his clothes would become discolored from the heat of the furnaces. So imagine the amount of time that this guy was spending in the lab. He also believed that when the only reason that you need your seed was to procreate. And if you were ever going to use your seed, it was only to be inserted into the womb of a woman. And if you weren't using your seed, if you were even to have lustful thoughts or even get one case of blue balls or whatever it is, that sperm, where, we all had that one sock under our bed in high school, wherever you deposited your seed would turn into monsters and atrocities. So in order to combat that, you needed to be castrated. That was the only way to fight that. This is according to him. That's kind of drastic. Like, even if you just chilled, no. Even if you have the slightest idea, and if you have the slight, you're gonna create monsters. You cannot put your seed anywhere in the world. You need to be castrated. That was him, because some people speculated that he was a hermaphrodite, that he was castrated, and he had this certain disease, which they state that he had deformed genitalia. So that's a whole rabbit hole in itself. He deserves a whole episode. This guy's a really weird guy, but then, like I said, these mad scientists of their time affected medicine today. Like, these guys were, because they were so crazy, is the way. That's why I'm telling you that people are writing about this stuff, and there was that one guy who was going to be like, all right, let me try it to see what happens.
I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. I would say for me personally, I try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I would agree with, Paracelsus when he says things like things are created with or without art. And, we have like the good homunculus version, the bad homunculus version. And then I would say I personally, I try to focus more on the more lighter aspects of the alchemical arts. And you definitely seem like you focus a lot more on the negative or the darker aspects, which is cool because it is really interesting. And I wonder, like, from your perspective, after doing all this research, do you have a bad opinion of alchemy as a whole? I'm always curious about it because I have my focus more on like the medicinal aspects of alchemy and the things that we have learned, and like people modern day working on creating medicines that help heal people and whatnot, and the like internal, the kind of soul purifying psychological correspondences and all that stuff. So I always wonder what other people, what your opinion would be.
So the reason I was excited to do this specific episode was just because you've obviously have some experience with alchemy and you talk about it a lot. I think that just like anything, it is first created from a neutral standpoint. And it's just like in Star Wars, right? The Force is there. The great work is there. The magnum opus is always there. It's how you use it. So you can either be on the side of the Jedis and use it for good, or you're going to be on the side of the Sith and use it for evil. And I think that's where I stand with this. Yeah. I am 100%. The reason I bring forth the negative aspects of it, it's because like everybody likes a good story. Everybody likes the gory detail. I think that's why true crime and everything that, all these stories and all these podcasts of true crime, that's why they're so popular, because they're giving everybody those gory bits, those occulted, you know what I mean? Like they're painting this picture like, oh, and there's something about the human nature. Back to the Dahmer thing. Why do they make so many documentaries of Dahmer? why do they push this guy so much in the media? Why do they put so many 100 documentaries, man? I know this guy better than I do my own family at this point. Like, I know every aspect of this dude's life, and it goes back to that primal nature of being fascinated by, not by gore, but like the darker bits of, you know what I mean, like
Well,
the
and
crime
I think
and all.
I am glad that you do too, because I think it's important not to be ignorant of the realities of the darker aspects of things, and also being aware of it is. And then if you're a person that wants to avoid things like that, then at least being aware of it can help you out, and you're not going to be pretending like things don't exist or just ignoring it, you know.
And that's one of the reasons why I do this research and why I do my podcast, and that's the reason I started the Juan on Juan podcast, because
One.
I can count on Juan to always be there, and Juan wasn't hearing what he wanted to hear on other shows about certain topics, so Juan took it upon himself to talk about what he wanted to talk about. So that's how that podcast was born, because people weren't talking about those connections. And like you said, I think it's important to know. There's one thing to know that you're in a game versus when you don't know and you're in a game. And it goes back to what David Icke was talking about. These elites know that they're in a game, so they live it in they have a view on life. You know, why do they need so much money? Well, because it's a real life game of Monopoly for them. They understand that they're in this quote unquote game, whether it's, you know, a video game or however you want to see it. But what David Icke talks about, there's one thing to know that you're in a prison, feel and touch the bars, and there's another thing to be in a prison that you can't touch and feel the bars. There's a different view and there's a different feel to that. So I think that by understanding, you can't tell me that the elites aren't there. If I'm able to find this stuff, if me, some regular guy, works a full-time job, has a family, is able to find this stuff, imagine the stuff that these people have access to.
Oh yeah.
And think about all the books that they have access to. And a lot of the wealthiest people in the world have extensive libraries of different literature. So
And laboratories,
yeah, that's
underground.
100%. So he goes. So I just want to give that background on Paracelsus, and I'm trying to find here the generation of the homunculus. Okay. So he starts off by talking about the opposite of a homunculus, which is a basilisk. And for those that don't know, a basilisk is like a mythical monster that's able to kill you with its glare. And he talks about the creation of it in this book he put on, the Natura Rerum, the nature of things. And he starts off by saying the creation of the basilisk, which is made from the menstrual blood of a woman, because mind you, this guy hated women. A menstrual blood of a woman sealed up in a flask and heated to the temperature of a horse's womb. The basilisk is considered the monster above all monsters because its glance can kill, just like the glance of a menstruating woman who also has a hidden poison in her eyes and can ruin mirrors with her gaze, make wounds impossible to heal, and spoil wine with her breath. The basilisk was the embodiment of women's impurities and their poisonous essence. This is coming from a guy who probably didn't have a girlfriend growing up.
I'd say not.
Yeah. So that's the creation of the basilisk, this monster. He goes on to talk about the creation of the masculine opposite of the basilisk, which is the homunculus, the little man. This is when the term homunculus was coined. We must now by no means forget the generation of homunculi. That's plural. Homunculus plural. For there is something to it, although it has been kept in great secrecy and kept hidden up to now. And there was not a little doubt and question among the old philosopher whether it even be possible to nature and art that a man can be born outside the female body and without a natural mother. I give this answer, that is by no means opposed to the spagyric art and to nature, but that it is indeed possible. But how this should happen and proceed, its process is thus: the sperm of a man be putrefied by itself in a cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb, or at least so long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which is easily observed. After this, it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent without a body. If after this it is fed wisely with the acronym of human blood and be nourished up to 40 weeks and be kept in the even heat of a horse's womb, a living human child grows therefrom. with all its members, like another child, which is born of a woman, but much smaller. Now, the homunculus, the reason that the homunculus was pure and was the embodiment of everything that there was because it wasn't tainted by the poisonous mixture from which the basilisk came from. So the menstrual blood of women. And the homunculus, according to Paracelsus, that reaches adulthood is said to become a marvelous being like a giant or dwarf. So we have this mythological aspect to the homunculus. Makes you think of what a Bigfoot is. Is a Bigfoot a runaway homunculus? Is the dog man a runaway homunculus? Or is it something much bigger? Is it a concept of the homunculus? These chimeras that were born from alchemy back then were our modern scientists doing the same thing. And oh, well, Bigfoot is interdimensional. The dogman is kind of interdimensional. Well, Paracelsus talks about that. They have supernatural strength and they know all things hidden and secret things. And the reason for that being because we talked about art and, the creation of life involving art, not art, that art being alchemy. And this is quote, they receive their life from art. Through art, they receive their body, flesh, bone, and blood. Through art, they are born. And therefore, art is embodied and inborn in them, and they need learn it from no one. So that's why the
Late to his overall assessment, I feel like women are pretty beautiful, and I think I'd definitely choose a woman over a homunculus, but that's just me. Oh man, that's good stuff right there.
Yeah, this guy again, very eccentric character. He was doing things that he was a very brilliant guy, but we know that what he was into according to the history. And there's a really good book. I have it here. I have it somewhere. Oh, here you go. Really good book you can read on him. It's called The Devil's Doctor by Philip Ball, Paracelsus in the World of Renaissance Magic and Science. And it's an entire book on cited some of my sources from here. So again, you can read about Paracelsus, and this is a really good book with that. And you can dive into his whole history. But like I said, that's a whole nother episode on itself. And I want to wrap up with the Crowleyan connection, the Crowleyan homunculus, the Crowley homunculus, however you want to say it, potato, tomato, whatever. And this is where I relate it to modern day occultism and modern day the elites and all this stuff. And in 1914, Crowley wrote the Liber 367 or 368. I'm not 100%. I think I might have gotten that wrong on my notes here. Vel de Homunculo, of the homunculus. And it is a set of instructions on how to create a homunculus, according to Crowley. I also mentioned that in 1917, he wrote the book, The Moonchild, which is a story about two sects of magicians that they're trying to fight over an unborn child. The Greeks, they understood that when the woman was in the gestation period, she could only intake certain things, listen to certain music, be in certain places, ingest certain things. It was an alchemical process for them when making babies. It makes you think about royalty too, right? Where royalty, I'm sure that they do certain things to make sure that their babies are born in a certain astrological sign. The Kardashians, I was watching the Kardashians for research purposes, of course. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the idea that they use surrogates, which you could take as an alchemical vessel. But one of the moms was boasting about how it was going to be a Leo. And that just hints at the fact that they're using astrology and they understand astrology and what is a Leo. I relate it to the alchemical dragon that eats the sun, but a Leo is charismatic, outgoing, right there in the spotlight. Keeping up with the Kardashians, they're in the spotlight, so they would want a Leo. I've also heard about stories on Tinfoil Hat recently. A guy was talking about how the elites will do C-sections to take out the baby to make sure it's born on a certain time, certain date. So it's not far-fetched. So Crowley wrote about it in 1914. He did the whole thing, and he said that up until the second month, the fetus doesn't have a soul. Up until the second month. And at the second month, the third month and on, it's embodied with a soul. And the way that you make a Crowleyan homunculus is by having sex with a woman with an astrological alignment. She has her own astrological things. A man also has, they have to be aligned astrologically, and they're going to have sex during certain astrological alignments in a ceremonial setting. They're going to invoke certain spirits. And when she becomes pregnant, she will be placed in a consecrated circle in the middle of a desert, preferably. And they're going to invoke certain energies, because in the middle of a desert, a wandering soul, the way he puts it, let me see if I can find it here. And this place should be a great desert, for in such do rarely wander any human soul seeking incarnation. What was the whole thing with Jack Parsons? He wanted to reincarnate the whore of Babylon. He was with L. Ron Hubbard in the middle of the desert. Essentially, they were just masturbating onto pieces of parchment and sigils and stuff like that, trying to invoke this being into existence. And his homunculus would be considered a femunculus because it was a woman, which is Margie Cameron, which was his the Scarlet Woman. And she also allegedly went on to create a cult where they were trying to make an interracial moon child. And it was orgies where they were trying to impregnate the women and invoke entities within, to Crowley, because they were Crowley followers. They wanted to invoke certain entities within these babies to invoke, to incarnate. And I relate this to antiquity. Speaking of great minds, you have Plato and the Platonic solids and the Archimedean solids, where I think that's the same concept, where they're trying to take this ethereal idea and incarnate it into a physical manifestation. So take that for what you will, but that's a whole nother podcast I can do on its own. But it's about this shortcut to manifestation. So they took an actual baby. They said it would be a regular baby, except it would be invoked with, you have Rosemary's Baby and all these movies where the son of the Antichrist is going to be born. This baby is going to be the Antichrist. You know what I mean? Where they invoke, and speaking of occulted stories, Rosemary's Baby was Roman Polanski. He wrote about a woman getting raped in order to have the son of the devil. And what did he end up getting accused of after the fact? Raping a young girl and having to flee the country. So these occultists, they are all putting out these stories similar to Moonchild about true events shrouded in a story like thing. And again, and I think that's got to do like with when a serial killer keeps memorabilia to relive that moment. I think that's what they do with these movies. They make stories out of them. And think about what an actor is. They're invoking a certain energy. They're invoking a certain character. So it goes back to the occult of invoking these certain energies. And they can rewatch it over and give that energy for people to watch at their houses, in theaters, to the world, revelation of method type of thing. And they also power that sigil. They also power that talisman. So essentially, this woman is going to be in this great circle, consecrated circle, to the sphere of the work, and she's going to be left there. She can only, they're going to do a subfumigation. She can only watch certain things. They're going to invoke certain energies. Now, I relate this to the whole thing with Epstein. But before we get to Epstein, I also want to touch on James Shelby Downard. He believed that the homunculus was inside the almost 500,000-pound giant steel bottle named Jumbo that the U.S. government placed near Ground Zero on July 16, 1945, at the Trinity site in New Mexico at the Land of Enchantment along the 33rd parallel. And not far from that, so essentially they were trying to radioactively make a homunculus. And somebody tagged me on some stuff on Twitter where they related to Twin Peaks and this other show. I don't have anything written down on that. I can send it to you. But this idea that there was a homunculus born from that, and I wouldn't put it past them, right? The idea that supposedly Jack Parsons was being spied on by the U.S. government. That's why L. Ron Hubbard was sent there, and Marjorie Cameron, because they were spies for the U.S. government to infiltrate his magical operations. And there's a story that, according to Michael Hoffman, I can't confirm this, but he states that Marjorie Cameron became pregnant after she showed up at Parsons' doorstep, and they did this sexual ritual for 2 weeks, and she was pregnant. He made her get an abortion, and allegedly she turned that abortion tissue over to the U.S. government, hinting at the fact that the U.S. government had some interest in this baby that was created out of magical sex ritual, essentially is what it is. And then some people said they took that fetal matter and they put it into this thing at the Trinity site to radioactively make this homunculus. Again, who knows? It's related. I think it's related to Frankenstein when they use electricity to make him come to life, right? He's alive, the whole thing where they use electricity. And not far from the Trinity site, I think it's about 100 and something miles, you have the house of Jeffrey Epstein. And Jeffrey Epstein has, just that if you look up an aerial view of the Zorro Ranch, where allegedly he wanted to impregnate 20 women to make a master race with his seed in it, outside of the house is a giant consecrated circle that resembles a labyrinth. And if you want to talk about the labyrinth symbolism, that's also we can relate it to the homunculus with Daedalus or Daedalus and the Minotaur and all that stuff. And I believe that, again, it was in the middle of 10,000 acres in the middle of a desert. And the compound is 33,339 square feet. And allegedly at this place, the Zorro Ranch, they were sexually abusing people, and they would record the elites allegedly doing things to people there to use as blackmail. Another operation that they were having there. But I think that they were also trying to make moon children, aka homunculus, in order to invoke certain energies into existence.
Yeah, and I remember I was going kind of deep for a while there, early on with the Epstein stuff, and I remember one of the women in Florida, I think it was a young girl actually, she had brought up that Epstein did mention to her something about what he's involved with experimental biology and stuff along those lines. And I always thought that was interesting because nobody really ever seems to bring that part up too much.
Well, yeah, he also has connections with transhumanistic agendas and projects. He did give a lot of money for certain things, just like Elon Musk. Elon Musk also naming his kids weird stuff, QR codes and stuff like that, like invoking certain, who knows? And for those saying, oh, this is kind of far-fetched to relate it to come full circle and talk about the Kardashians doing all this stuff, how I mentioned at the beginning, magical systems are meant to be changed. They're meant to be modified. They're meant to fit your intentions, your system. It doesn't, you don't need to adhere to a certain a book, a certain grimoire. No, you can add your own spice. What is it? Everything nice. You mix it with chemical X and you get what? 3 little girls, powder puff girls. You know what I mean? Like, you have this whole idea there too, where it's another form of homunculus. And it went from a spiritual thing to a scientific thing to a science fiction to a pseudoscience to a legend now. So not only does the concept evolve throughout time, but also just how the magical system is meant to evolve throughout time. It's it's the same concept.
Yeah.
But they kind of they're kind of like in opposite ways of each other. Like the homunculus is like de-leveling, and then magic is like going up. You know what I mean? Like it's like this cross thing. So again, that's the history sort of the homunculus. And like I said, I write about it in my journals and I give sources there. And for those that want to look further, I encourage people to do their own research, come up with their own assumptions, and don't take my word 100% for it. I'm just a guy who enjoys talking about really interesting things and connecting dots that might have otherwise not been there. And I really haven't heard anybody go into this much depth and detail of this subject, because again, it is occulted, and I think it's occulted for a reason, but it's all there if you look and if you know where to look.
Definitely. Appreciative that you're doing what you're doing with it. Can I ask you a couple more questions before we sign off?
Yeah.
I was just curious, did Crowley ever claim to have been successful in creating a homunculus or a moonchild or whatever?
According to his story Moonchild, which I hate Crowley, by the way. I think he was the scum of the earth, and unfortunately, he did attribute a lot of great things to the occult scene. But other than that, he was a piece of shit human being. I just want to make that clear. And unfortunately, I was reading the book The Moonchild, and according to that, yeah, it happened in that story, and it's actually a pretty decent story. I hate to say it, but it was actually kind of like captivating me when I was reading the book. It's decently written, and according to that, I mean, that's what they were. Some of the characters in that story are allegedly modeled after other people. His arch nemesis of the other Secret Side is the not the Golden Dawn. Anyways, he had a whole beef with all these other magicians and stuff like that. But I think that yeah, he was able to. If you look into the history of Crowley, one of his children died very shortly after she was born. Now, I wouldn't put it past him if that was a sacrifice of some sort, or they needed some sort of tissue to do a ritual of some sort. I wouldn't put it past them at all. So there's that history. If you want to really look into his whole history, which I have, which unfortunately, but yeah, I do think he was a piece of shit, and I don't support him as a person. He did do some, like the other day, I was flipping through, I forgot, Amazon or something. There was this author who wrote all the good works of Crowley. And mind you, this dude written a lot of books. And that particular book, out of all the things he's written, out of everything that Crowley's written, the book was only 88 pages long. So I'm like, wow, this is a book of the greatest works of Crowley, aside from all the dogma and all this stuff. And you can only come up with 88 pages. Wow, it really says a lot. And if you look into how many books he authored, or at least excerpts or pieces that he wrote all of stuff. And maybe he was full of it, and he was boasting about doing things that he didn't do. But do I think that in the story, they do make one? Now in real life, maybe they attempted to make one, is what I want to say. They attempted to make one. If it worked or not, who knows? But Parsons was using his method, and Parsons allegedly made it happen. So,
and was the intention to make this, was it intended to be like a demonic entity, or like a bad, like harmful entity, or what was the purpose in terms of like the personality or the character of the homunculus? Or
so Crowley's or the homunculus in general?
Yeah, Crowley's.
They wanted to invoke it was an Egyptian entity into it. I don't have the name written down,
okay.
But his whole thing with the Cairo workings and ayahuasca and all these, but it was an Egyptian entity that they wanted to invoke into it. So use your imagination as to whether it was a good one or not. It was their whole thing was about invoking the Aeon of Horus or something like that.
Interesting. Okay.
Which again in Egyptian cosmology would be considered another homunculus, where he was a miniature version of after he was reborn, after his wife took his phallus and impregnated herself, again using herself as an alchemical vessel. After he was dead, he was born in a miniature version of himself. Again, another version of the homunculus. You can see the correlations every which way you put it.
Yeah. All right. Last question. I would just, with all of the different fascinating like lines of research and rabbit holes that you've gone down, I'm curious, what is something that stands out to you recently, or just overall, that you find particularly fascinating, whether it be like a theory or a historic event, or just whatever, just something in all your research that kind of really struck you as fascinating?
So as of recently, I've been looking into what I'm going to get into next, but one of the things that I've been peeling the layers back of is this idea. I got this book here, Pythagorean Palaces, Magic and Architecture in the Italian Renaissance, and the idea that, again, these buildings can be used as talismans to invoke certain things, and the idea that they would take architecture and they would invoke higher levels of consciousness within them, but only the initiated are able to see this imaginary scaffolding within these buildings. And I've been digging into that, and I've been going down the rabbit hole of, again, it's alchemical, where you use reality to affect the grander, you use your micro to affect the macro. So I want to do a deep dive into the origins of chess. And I know there was that one controversy as of recently with the chess player cheating and supposedly using anal beads to unlock his certain type of kundalini or
Nice.
chakras. And the idea that the origins of that game, similar to Enochian chess, it was a philosophical type of thing where they used the game to invoke change in reality. So a sort of sympathetic, magical point of view from it, where we use inanimate things to invoke changes in other places. That's what I've been trying to get at as of recent. And I'm going to start with chess and see where that goes. So I got like a whole bunch of different books that I'm just sitting on. This is also a really fascinating book. I took some sources from here. It's called The Artificial Humans from Pygmalion to Present, Falling in Love with Statues, again by George L. Hersey, one of my favorite authors. And I'm just playing around right now with different ideas. And yesterday I was on a stream with Dr. Narco Longo from Old World, Florida. He's real deep into astrology, and he was talking to me about how people are able to use their astrological sign to invoke certain energies out to help them in the real world. So you have Salvador Dali with his little horns and his little, he was a Taurus. So that type of thing, sympathetic magic mostly. But again, I come across, I like to think of these concepts as toys that are made of thoughts and ideas, and you just play with them for a little bit and then you put it away. I have this memory palace that's just full of weird trinkets, and it makes me think of Guillermo del Toro's new show on Netflix, the Cabinet of Curiosities or something like that, where he's like a whole bunch of different stories. And I feel that's like my mind palace at the moment, where it's just like full of just weird shit on the wall. Like my wall behind me, it's like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm just trying to have a dope podcast.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I love it. I listened to one of the episodes of yours. I really liked it. You and a guy were you're kind of going into Raymond Lull a little bit, and
Oh yeah, Gabe.
he's just somebody interesting to me, and I'm trying to learn more about him. That was a cool one. But yeah, I think you definitely have like a really unique perspective and angle with how you're going about things, and you really add a lot of value in digging up and kind of compiling and unearthing a lot of cool information. So I love it, and I appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me. It was really fun.
Yeah, dude, for sure. And thank you for having me on. I was really excited for this one. And for people who can appreciate this sort of weird knowledge without judging too much, it's like I have all these ideas in my head. It's like, where do I unload them? But dude, this is like this topic. No matter, I've had I've had people write to me, dude. After I went on Tinfoil Hat, I had people writing to me, asking me, telling me that they had homunculus and how to take care of them. Number one. And then I had this other guy write to me. He's like, "Hey, dude, I think I'm a homunculus. Can you help me?" Like, this dude, I'm like, "Hey, bro, this is like normal people don't do this." And he's like, "No, my family's not." No, like, he's going on like this whole thing, and I'm like,
Oh man,
I just told me he was a homunculus, and whatever. Anyways, but people really find this topic super intriguing and interesting, and honestly, it started with my first appearance on Donut Factory, and that kind of sort of blew up over there, and yeah, I've had a bunch of people just hit me up, and I coined myself the homuncologist. So this exciting new field of
we need
homuncology.
Yeah, we need
the
more
revival.
Of them.
Yeah. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to throw out any place the listeners can find you and your work?
Yeah, any podcast, RSS feed, Juan on Juan podcast. My website's the juanonjuanpodcast.com. You can find my comic book on there. You can find my journal on there. It'll link you to my Ko-Fi. I do have a Patreon. I do post exclusive episodes on there. I do esoteric study sessions where I go on, do a 2.5 hour episode with source material and I develop a whole thing like this on real time as I'm reading the stuff and pulling information from different sources. And that's really fun too. I like to do that on the fly. And yeah, you can find me at the101podcast.com. I do have a YouTube channel, TikTok, Instagram is my main account. You can find me on there. And I had a ton of fun, man. Appreciate you.
Hell yeah, man. Definitely appreciate you as well. And we'll be in touch.
Sure.